Okay, tell me if you've heard this story before. I grew up a Christian, but I went to college and I found out the Bible was not historically reliable. So after many sleepless nights, I finally decided I can't be a Christian anymore. I finally realized that the New Testament's unreliable, and so we can't really know who Jesus was or what he said. Unfortunately, I think this is a very common occurrence in colleges today, and I certainly experienced that. Fortunately, I came out on the other side of it, and my Christian faith was even stronger after college, but not for the lack of the professors trying. And they clearly have biases. There's just no doubt that they have biases as they're teaching this stuff, and they don't represent the other side very well at all. And so in this video, I just want to talk about what are the tools that these professors are using at my college and probably a lot of other colleges to try and convince students to not believe in Christianity, and how can we combat those tools. So I've got 3 tools that I know my professor used and that others are probably using. And then if you're a Christian, stick around to the end. I've got some advice just based on everything we're talking about of how to move forward, how to live in light of what we're talking about. That's really important. So stick around for that. In order to frame our conversation well, I'm going to frame it in terms of the Jesus Seminar. So what is the Jesus Seminar? The Jesus Seminar was a group of scholars who got together to try and figure out what was historical about Jesus's life from the Gospels. Which events actually occurred, which events didn't occur, what did he say, what didn't he say, those kind of things. And the way they did it was each member cast a vote. So for each section of the gospel, they basically voted and they said, yeah, this is historical, this is probably historical, no, this isn't historical, etc. And the way they did this was they actually had different colored beads and they would put them in bowls. And so you could get, once you had all 30 scholars, it was 30 or 40 scholars maybe in total. Once you had a bead from each scholar, then you could count them up. It's like how many black beads, how many blue beads, how many red beads, etc. And then simple majority rules. Boom, we know if it was historical or not based on how these scholars voted. You get a bunch of scholars in a room, vote on something, what could go wrong, right? Majority rule, sounds great. Unfortunately, this is exactly where things went wrong. And this is the first tool that they use in order to kind of pull the wool over our eyes to make us think, oh, this is historical. This Jesus Seminar was invite only. And so they invited only other scholars who basically agreed with them, who had the same philosophical outlook. And what happened was they started the research with a bias in terms of it being the only unbiased position. And what was that bias? It was a naturalistic, non-theistic view of the world. So immediately they were saying that if anything was reported as a miracle in the Gospels, automatically non-historical. Oh, Jesus healed a blind man? Non-historical. They didn't even try to give alternative explanations. Like if there was really good historical evidence that this blind man was no longer blind after encountering Jesus, they didn't even try to give like, oh, maybe there was like some psychological stuff going on here where like faith healings really happen. The man really, like the power of psychology, you convince someone that they can be healed and they're healed. No, they would just say, nah, it didn't happen. That was their bias. And they did this for anything supernatural. It was just automatically disregarded. But what C.S. Lewis reminds us of in his book on miracles is that this is not a historical question. Like whether God exists or whether miracles can happen, that's not a historical question. That's a philosophical question. And so when these historians, they simply deny miraculous events because it's miraculous and supernatural, they're no longer being historians. They're being philosophers. But that's not what they're claiming to be. And so they've mixed these two fields together. And instead of relying on the evidence, if the evidence points towards miracles, then you should go with the evidence as a historian and then take a step back and say, okay, as a historian, it seems like the miracle is plausible. Let's take a step back from the evidence and let's discuss other possibilities. They don't do that. They just outright deny that miracles happen, and therefore, even though the historical evidence points to the contrary. And so it's honestly quite ironic because what I've heard over the years is the accusation that Christians ignore evidence due to faith. It's like, oh, you just believe that because you believe that. The evidence doesn't actually point to it. But the Jesus Seminar did exactly that. They took a presupposition, an a priori belief, and they said, we're going to ignore the evidence because we know miracles don't happen. And so this is exactly what my professor did to me as well. When he would present ideas about how the New Testament contradicts itself or how the different eyewitness testimonies about the resurrection or about the empty tomb or things like that don't measure up, he presented it as if it were the unbiased, only intelligent position possible. It's that posturing that made me doubt more than anything because he wasn't presenting the other side. He was simply saying, no, this is the only tenable position. But years later, come to find out, like over time of reading, it's like, no, there is really good reasons to believe that the New Testament is highly historically reliable. And I've got other videos on that. But this professor was more concerned about getting students to believe his perspective than he was about teaching them how to think. And that's the most sad part, is like, what's the goal of a professor, or what's the goal of a teacher in general? It's like, you should be teaching your students how to think, not just what to think. But that did not seem to be a concern for my professor. And then the second tool that they used, that I don't even know if you could call it a tool, it's more of just a mistake, is there were, going back to the Jesus seminar, there were unqualified people in the seminar. In the group of scholars. Like, I think they had one PhD who was a PhD in modern poetry voting on what sayings or events of Jesus's life are historical. Like, what is happening right now? I can't remember the exact number, but I think it's at least half of the people of the scholars in the Jesus seminar didn't even have a degree in a relevant field to decide whether or not these events or sayings were historical. And so what is the standard? That's the question, right? What is the actual standard for a scholar to then be able to speak into this issue? And I would say it's threefold. This is pretty common. This is not just me here. Having a terminal degree in a relevant field, so whether it's history or New Testament studies or something like that. Second, have a teaching position at a university in the same field. And third, publishing peer-reviewed works. And why are these three important? For one thing, a PhD is important because a lot of people think the difference between a master's degree and a PhD is like the difference between reading one book and 10 books. That's so far from the truth. Really, the difference is like, for a master's degree, it's like reading 10 books on one subject of a lot of subjects. For a PhD, it's reading every single book on a specific topic. Like, that's not a joke. When you write a dissertation, you are expected to know and to have read all of the literature about your topic, period. I'm a current PhD student, and my desire is to do a dissertation related to the resurrection, which means I have to know everything about the resurrection. I need to know all of the arguments for and against and all the different methods of studying it. Like, it's going to be a ton of work, far more work than I've ever put into a single topic ever. And so this is a high bar for someone to finally claim that they're an expert in something. And then second, teaching, it shows that you're keeping up with scholarship, right? Like, you're in the field and you're active in that field. It's not like you got a PhD 30 years ago and then you went and you worked for McDonald's after that. It's like, no, you've been in the field since you've graduated with your PhD, you've still been in the field. And the peer-reviewed articles and such is very similar, except I would add that when you have peer-reviewed research, you have other scholars who are saying, okay, you're not completely crazy. So you kind of have consensus like, okay, this guy knows what he's talking about. He's got credentials and he does contribute to scholarship in this field. And so these are the qualifications that I think are really important when we are saying such radical statements like the New Testament's not reliable, or Jesus didn't say that, Jesus didn't do that. Like, these are very nuanced questions. It's so easy for anyone to just say anything online. YouTube is the perfect example. Anyone on here can say whatever they want, and if it sounds good enough, a lot of people believe them. But you really have to ask the question, what are their credentials? What kind of research have they done to come to this conclusion? And oftentimes, not enough. And so this is exactly what my professor did to me again. It wasn't just that he presented his opinions as the unbiased intellectual standard of New Testament studies, but also he wasn't the expert. Like, he was basically lying. He had a master's degree, he had a master's of divinity, and he was an adjunct professor, and he was a Methodist pastor at a church. Like, that's what he did. And yet he was posturing himself as the expert in the field when he was making these claims by not giving the counter arguments. And so I'm not saying that if you don't have a PhD and you don't have a peer-reviewed article published and you don't have a teaching degree that you can't say anything about anything. Of course not. I'm a PhD student, so I don't match those qualifications. You can still say stuff, but give multiple sides. Like admit your bias and don't demean the opposition or demean the other side by saying, "Oh yeah, only fools would think that." Like that's been obviously disproven or debunked. It's not helpful. And again, it goes back to this idea of what are professors there for? They're there to teach you how to think, not just feed you what to think. That happens way too much in today's world with social media and everything. We want to learn how to think, not just what to think. For the third tool that they used to bias people towards their perspective is the Jesus Seminar misuse their own historical methodology. New Testament scholars often call this the criteria of authenticity. And what the criteria of authenticity do, there's like 7 to 10, depending on who you ask, 7 to 10 primary ones, and there's a bunch of other stuff, but 7 to 10 primary ones. And what they try to do is determine the probability that an event occurred. And they can be helpful for that. It helps you determine, oh yeah, okay, this event, based on historical methodology, it was pretty likely or very likely or not very likely. There's no certainty or complete uncertainty. There's the widest ends are impossible with historical inquiry, but you're always in this limbo of probability from less probable to more probable. That's why these exist. And so an example of a criterion of authenticity is called double dissimilarity. And what double dissimilarity says is that if an event or a saying of Jesus is both dissimilar from early Christian belief or early Christian practice and Jewish culture, it's more likely to be historical. Why more likely to be historical? Well, because if it's different from early Christian belief, Christians would be less likely to add it back into history and say, oh, let's put this into Jesus's mouth. And then if it wasn't borrowed from Jewish culture, or if it's different from Jewish culture, it's also less likely to be borrowed from Jewish culture or be attributed to Jesus because of Jewish culture. And so as an example, the Son of Man title for Jesus is doubly dissimilar. The early Christians didn't often use this title for Jesus. They had other titles that they preferred, like Christ, Messiah, Son of God, things like that. Very rarely did they use Son of Man, this title. On the flip side, in Jewish culture, the Son of Man was not a common name that was attributed or a common title for the Messiah that they were expecting. And so boom, both dissimilar from Jewish culture, dissimilar from early Christian faith. And so the only explanation for why it would exist in the Gospels is because Jesus actually called himself the Son of Man. Boom. Historical method done. We have used double dissimilarity, this criterion, to say, yeah, it is very, very likely that Jesus often and repeatedly called himself the Son of Man. Now, here's where the problem comes. What the Jesus Seminar did is they used this criterion in reverse. And they said, if something doesn't meet this criterion, it is therefore unhistorical. It's therefore likely that it did not occur. But if you're thinking, you immediately see the problem with this. Because what's happening is Jesus was the founder of Christianity. So there's going to be a lot of things about Christianity that is similar to Jesus. And Jesus was a Jew. And so there's going to be a lot of things about Jesus that's similar to Jewish culture. And so if you say anything that can't be either from Jewish culture or from early Christianity isn't historical about Jesus, Jesus basically disappears. And so this criterion of double dissimilarity only works one way. It's like a very high bar that if something meets this standard, it's very likely that it's historical, but just because something doesn't meet that standard doesn't mean it's unhistorical. So I know can be a little confusing to wrap your head around, but I hope that's clear. And so what the Jesus Seminar did was they used a lot of these criteria of authenticity, not just double dissimilarity, but the others as well. And they often said, like, if these events don't meet such and such criteria, it is therefore unhistorical. And that's just not a good way to use these criteria. It's not being intellectually honest. What would have been more intellectually honest is if they said, using these criteria of authenticity, we cannot confirm whether this event occurred. To me, that's fine. You say, okay, there's some events that we can use historical methodology to confirm it happened, or say it's very likely that it happened, and then some maybe less likely based on this, that, or the other evidence. It doesn't meet these criteria, so we can't tell you whether or not it's historical based on our current methodology. Much more intellectually honest. Instead, they stretch the truth to make it sound more convincing than it really is. And this is exactly what my professor did. He would give us just enough evidence that it sounds good, but he wouldn't actually teach us all of these criteria of authenticity or how in-depth these arguments can really get, so that we could decide what we think for ourselves, what is more likely. Is it more likely that Jesus said it or that he didn't? Instead, it was just, it's presented in such a way that you better believe this, because no one else takes any other position seriously. And that's just, I just don't find that helpful really at all. And so how do we combat this error? Unfortunately, there's not really an easy way to do it. You kind of have to play the game, meaning you have to learn the criteria and you have to learn how these conversations are happening. And so I do have a full introduction video on the criteria of authenticity and on how to study the Gospels as history. So you can go take a look at that video when you have time. It's about 30 minutes, and it is pretty exhaustive introduction to how to do history with the Gospels. And I found a lot of help when I learned this stuff. So it may be helpful for you, because unfortunately there's just no shortcut to critical thinking, right? Like you can either just absorb information and regurgitate it, or you can truly take the time to think about things critically. And then you can have an answer for some of these critiques. And I think it can be really helpful. What is my main issue with how these three tools, these three mistakes are made? Really, it's not that they teach their perspective. Everyone is teaching their perspective. I'm sharing my perspective right now. It's that they don't take into consideration the other side. And so you really have to ask yourself, when someone is presenting something, are they thinking about both sides? Are they steel manning the opposition, or are they straw manning the opposition? And are they admitting that there are good points on both sides and yet they land on this side because of such and such reason? Or are they even presenting the other side? Are they challenging without forcing doubt? I think challenging a student to think is great, but when you force them into a position where they have to doubt, especially for the wrong reasons, not because you present really good evidence to the contrary, but because you posture in a certain way that if you disagree with me, now you're disagreeing with all of scholarship about this topic. It's like, that's not really honest. There are some things that are genuinely like that, where you have to say, actually, no one thinks that, so you should probably listen to them. But that's not often the case. And then lastly is just demeaning the other side, right? Like position of pride. That really gets to the heart of it, is the posturing and putting yourself up as the expert when you're not. It really just drips of pride, and it just rubs me the wrong way. So what are the tools that the Jesus Seminar used? One, they pretended their view was the only intellectual view. 2, they postured themselves as the only authority in scholarship. And 3, they misused their own methodology, and they don't really address their methodology very well. And so that's what the Jesus Seminar did. That's what my professor did. And I'm sure it's what a lot of professors in New Testament studies are doing all over the country, unfortunately. And so my plea to Christians specifically is, let's not be like that. When we're having conversations, when we're having, arguments maybe, or just disagreements with non-Christians about truth, let's not demean their position. Like, I'm a skeptic at heart. Like, I can totally understand why someone would doubt the existence of God. It is a complicated topic. And the reason I research and I study so much is because I have questions. And so I can empathize with their side. And I think we do a disservice when we do the same thing and we posture ourselves as, oh, we know the truth. We have all the answers because we know God exists and we know Jesus, this, that, the other. I don't think it's helpful for the conversation. And so my plea is, let's learn from the Jesus Seminar. Let's learn from these professors, and let's be different. Let's not just play their game the way they want to play it, but let's hold our positions with humility. And second, let's not stretch the truth when we don't know the answer, especially if you're into apologetics like I am. Don't stretch the truth of certain apologetic claims just because you want to win an argument. If God is real, and I certainly believe he is, he does not need us to defend him. He can make his own way. Yes, he does want us to be able to make an argument for the faith that is in us, for the hope that is in us, as Peter says. But we don't have to explain something if we don't know it. We don't have to pretend to know something we don't know. Saying I don't know is perfectly reasonable. And then when you say, I don't know, then you can go to the research and you can come back and you can have that conversation again and say, hey, I looked this up. What do you think? That's relational. And so as we're having these discussions and these arguments, more than ever, I think the most important thing is love. Love is going to attract more people to Christianity than a good argument ever could. Yes, there is something to be said for an argument. I'm making an argument in this video, but a professor once told me, the gospel spreads at the rate of relationships. And I think that's really true. And so we don't have to win arguments, and especially we don't have to do it in a prideful way in order to win people to Christ. It's more about being honest and sure, being as intellectual as we can be and knowing how to defend the faith, but defending it with humility and truthfulness, not stretching the truth in any way. I think that's even more vital in today's world where anyone can say anything and people are getting arguments all the time, like let's be gracious and let's be loving and let's be humble as we defend our faith. So yeah, like I said earlier, check out my other video on the criteria of authenticity if you are curious about that. Want to dive a little deeper there. In general, I just want this channel to be a place where I don't give any shallow answers to deep, nuanced questions about the New Testament. Like I said, I'm naturally a skeptic, and so I want to know the exact reasons that things are the way they are. And there are tough questions that need answering about the New Testament, whether it's apologetics or theological interpretation or exegesis or things like that. I want to do my best to give nuanced answers to difficult questions. So if you are interested in that, I would love for you to subscribe and join me. And I'm trying to post a video every week as I continue to learn and grow myself. So thanks for your time. Looking forward to see you next week. Peace.